9.1, this is your notes and your homework all in one. And we're talking about two things. We're talking about direct variation and indirect variation. Which indirect variation is also known as inverse variation. They mean the same thing. Okay? Indirect or inverse variation, it can be written either way. Sometimes it says indirectly, sometimes it says inversely. But either one, it's the same thing. So, direct variation you learned about in 8th grade or when you were in Algebra 1. And inverse variation, you probably talked about it a little bit in physics or in chemistry, one of the two. But we haven't actually, it's not been anything that's been taught up to this point. I just wanted to review direct with you today, and then I'm teaching you inverse because it's a brand new topic for you. So when things vary directly, what that means is one thing gets bigger, the other thing gets bigger as well. So like an easy example of inverse variation is as you pour like water into a, for direct variation, as you make the length of a rectangle longer, what happens to the area of the rectangle? It gets bigger. So as one thing gets bigger, the other one gets bigger. That's direct variation. You probably heard it as directly proportional as well. That kind of means the same thing. Okay? So direct variation, this equation is the equation today that you are going to be writing. Y equals kx. K is your constant of variation. When you look at this equation, y equals kx, what equation does that kind of look like? Mx. So really, k, our constant of variation, is technically then our slope. Okay? Our constant of variation is technically our slope. So if I were to graph it, this would be linear data. Okay? If I were to graph this, it would be linear. All right, so to find your constant of variation, which our constant of variation is technically our slope, all we have to do is we do y divided by x. Okay, so to find the constant of variation, you do y divided by x. So you're going to be asked to do two different things on this assignment. You're going to be asked to find the equation for this form, whatever it is, for the situation. So either direct or indirect. You're going to have to find your constant of variation. You're also going to be asked to find different values of x and y. So you're going to have several different things that you're going to have to do. So you have to make sure you pay attention to what they're asking you to do. And this seems kind of weird. So when you're finding your constant of variation, to find the constant of variation for direct variation, you need to divide. Okay, so when you're finding your constant of variation, you need to divide. But when you write it in your equation, are you dividing here? No, this is all multiplication. So that's the part where things get a little bit confusing because the opposite is going to be true for indirect variation. Okay, the other thing I want you to write, and I want you to write this at the top, is I want you to write y varies blank as x. Okay, I want you to write that y varies blank as x. In that blank can be the words indirect, direct, or inversely. Okay, so but it always is y varies blank as x because sometimes they don't give you x and y. Sometimes they give you other things, like they say your hours vary directly with your distance. So you need to know how that phrasing is written, what that translates into. Okay, that it's always y varies, whichever word you have in the problem, as x. Okay. All right, so the second type of variation is indirect or inverse variation. So this one's different. This is our new function that we're going to be learning about starting today. All of 9 and I think 10 are over what we call rational functions. Rational functions is anything where x is in the denominator. And we said the word rational meant what? Do y'all remember what rational means? It's fractional. So rational is fractional. And so in all of our problems that we're going to see for the next, I think until spring break, everything is going to have x's in the denominator. So we're going to be learning what that means and how that affects your graph. So when we have things that vary indirectly or inversely, to find our constant of variation, instead of dividing, what do we have to do to find k? We multiply. So our constant of variation for inverse variation or indirect variation, we do y times x. So to find our constant of variation, we multiply this time. So for questions 1 through 3, you have to decide if the data in the table shows direct or inverse variation, and then you need to write an equation that relates to the variables. So it's going to fall into one of two categories. Either this data is going to vary directly, or this data is going to vary inversely or indirectly. And again, those two words mean the same thing, inversely, indirectly. By the way, if direct variation means as one thing gets bigger, the other one gets bigger, what do you think inverse or indirect variation means? As one gets bigger, the other one goes smaller. Okay, so they have an opposite effect on each other. So if they vary directly, then what that means is if I divide 4 by 2.5, then it should be the same as 1.5 divided by 8. If they vary directly, then when I divide 4 by 2.5, it should be the same as 1.25 divided by 8. Okay, which number did I put on top? The y value, because direct variation is y divided by x. That's how we find our constant of variation. So if they vary directly, then what we're saying is that when we divide these, we're basically finding our constant of variation. We're trying to figure out if I divide 4 by 2.5, what's the constant of variation? If I do 1.25 divided by 8, what is that constant of variation? Are they the same? So what is 4 divided by 2.5? What's 4 divided by 2.5? 1.6. Okay. What is 1.25 divided by 8? 0.15625. Okay. Are these two the same? So that means they don't have the same constant of variation? It is not direct variation. So direct means if you divide them, they should give you the same thing. So what do you think inversely means? When you multiply them, they should give you the same thing. So that means that 4 times 2.5, if they vary inversely, then 4 times 2.5 should equal 1.25 times 8. That they will have the same constant of variation when you multiply them. So what is 4 times 2.5? 10. What is 1.5 times 8?
10.
So were those the same?
Yes.
Then this varies inversely.
So you would write y varies inversely as x?
So you would write y varies inversely as x. Or indirectly. And then your equation is going to be y equals k divided by x. But we need to figure out what k is. Okay, because it asks us to write our equation. So if it's inverse, it's y equals k divided by x. Well, let's go back and look. To find our constant of variation, to find k, what do? Multiply. Did we already multiply? What is k in this problem? So our equation would be y x. Problem 4 says if y varies directly with x, so this time they told you they vary directly. It says, and y is 10 when x is 24. What is the value of x when y is 14? So this time they've given you a little bit different information. They've told you how it varies, so we don't have to figure that out. We know that. They gave us some numbers. What did they give us? 10 and 24, and what did you say? What did you say?
Oh, it's a proportion.
It's going to end up being a proportion. Because if it varies directly, I need to do y divided by x, so that's 10 divided by 24 equals, well then my next set of numbers, they told me they want to know what is x when y is 14. So if y is 14, is that going to go on top in the numerator or on bottom in the denominator? The top, because we put the y's on top, so 14 over x, because I don't know what x is, well now I have a proportion. How do I solve those? Butterfly, cross multiply, and divide, however you learned it, because I don't really know, different teachers teach it different ways. But no matter what, you end up cross multiplying and dividing, and you end up getting some number for x. And I believe, if I remember correctly, that you get 33.6. Okay. So when you cross multiply and divide, you end up with x equals 33.6. But that's not all the problem asks us for. What else did the question ask us to do? Write an equation to model this function. So if I'm writing an equation to model this function, my equation is y equals kx. That's what my equation is supposed to look like. How do I find k for direct variation? What did it tell us?
Y divided by x.
Y divided by x. So I already have that set up. This is y divided by x. So what is 10 divided by 24? 0.4. Can you put it in a fraction for me? What is it, 5 over 12?
Yes.
Okay. So k is 5 over 12. So my equation is y equals 5 over 12x. So problem 6, given that y varies inversely as x, and y is 8 when x is 3, what is the value of y when x is 12? So they told us that it varies inversely. So if they vary inversely, what do we need to do? Multiply. So what's my first set of data they gave us?
3 over 8.
8 and 3, but I'm not dividing them this time, I am multiplying. So 8 times 3 needs to equal what? Y times 12, because I don't know what y is this time. It says, what is y when x is 12? So y times 12. Okay, so what is 8 times 3?
24.
24, so I get 24 equals 12y. How do I solve that? Divide by 12, and I end up with y equals 2. So that's half of my answer, because the first question said, what is y when x is 12, so y is 2. So then I need to write my equation, because it also asked me to do that, to write an equation to model this function. That equation is going to be y equals k divided by x. So k, my constant of variation in this problem. How do I find k for a inverse variation problem? Y times x. Well, I already know what y times x is. What is y times x? 24. So k equals 8 times 3, or 24. So my equation for this would be y equals 24 divided by x. And that is my second answer that I need to come up with for this problem. Okay, so on question 8, it says the time t in hours it takes a pump to empty a tank of water varies inversely with the pumping rate r in gallons per hour. So I just want to talk about this with you because this is one of those times where it uses the weird variables. So you need to make sure that you know, because there's no x's and y's there. So at the very beginning I told you to write y varies blank as x. So we have to interpret that for this problem. So here's our phrase, varies inversely. What did they give us first? What variable? T. So in this case, t is essentially our y. Okay, t is essentially y, and then what's the variable they gave us second? R. So that means that for us, r is basically x.